Today's devotion is titled Set Out for God. And we are on 210, day 210, July the 29th. And today, our morning rinse is 2 Kings 21 through 25, which means that we have completed another book. We are done with the 1st and 2nd Kings duo, if you will. And today's featured verses include 2 Kings 23:3 and also verse 25 of that same chapter. And it says, "The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord, to walk after the Lord, and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to carry out the words of this covenant that were written in this book." And all the people entered into the covenant. And then verse 25 says, "Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the laws of Moses. Nor did any like him arise after him." Out of all the kings of Judah, there were no kings like Josiah before or after him. He purposed in his life to be set out for godly ways. And at the young age of 8 years old, his father, Amon, died, and he took over the throne. And despite both Amon and his grandfather Manasseh doing evil in the sight of the Lord, Josiah purposed in his heart to be different. He had a heart for God. And I am sure that the scribes read the law to him as he was growing up, just like they probably read it to his father and grandfather. And he had access to the priests just like they had access. The resources and the scenarios for him to learn God's ways were very similar to his father and his grandfather. But his choices and what he set out to pursue made him completely different, which also changed what those around him were set out to pursue. He made a covenant before the Lord to keep his commandments, and Josiah kept that covenant, becoming the most godly king of Judah in all of history. He talked the talk, he walked the walk, he put his faith in action. I mean, he was the real deal. And during his reign, he made choices that began changing Judah as a complete entire nation, including removing everything ungodly from the temple. He, removed things like even the idolatrous priests. If you look at chapter 23, verse 3, it shares that he removed the idolatrous priests. He even did away with the horses that were used in the procession to worship the sun. That was also in chapter 23, verse 1. He also reinstated the Passover celebration. He revived obedience to God's law, and people were following him. I mean, Josiah purposed in his heart to be obedient, and then the people followed suit behind him. He set out to be holy. He set out to pursue holiness. He set out to pursue God's ways. Many kings came after him who did not make these same choices, which caused God to remove his hand of protection on Judah during their reign, allowing their enemy to capture them as slaves throughout the history. And our choices of what we set out to pursue will influence not just our lives, but the lives of those around us. So the question is, are you set out for God in every area of your life? And if we look at, some of the kings of Judah, there were some good kings, but they weren't like Josiah. They might have started out good and then ended their life being in disobedience. They might have had a portion of their heart that sort of obeyed, but not like Josiah. Josiah set out. He set out for God, which is why I titled today's devotion as we end the book of 2 Kings. May we be like Josiah. May we set out for God in everything. And this makes me talk about the gray areas of our lives, like those gray areas that are not necessarily commanded in the Bible, but yet they might not necessarily, cause us to be closer to God. I hear oftentimes, I heard growing up, I don't so much anymore, but I heard oftentimes, as a young adult, and even sometimes, people would say to me, well, it doesn't say in the Bible that we can't do that. Yeah. I mean, there are things in the Bible that say, clearly you should not murder, or you should not do this or that, or do this in order to get closer to God. But then there's other areas of our lives that is kind of gray. And those gray areas sometimes can, confuse us. The question would be, does it, matter? Some things clearly aren't going to matter. But then there's some things that may cause either us to stumble or someone else to stumble. And I can vouch for, some of the gray areas in my life. I had to choose, okay, and make it black and white for me. And it may not necessarily be black and white for you. I look at Josiah and, it says in the Bible, in our featured verse, the king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments, which, is a black and white thing, and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and with all his soul, and to carry out the words of this covenant that were written in the book. And all the people entered the covenant. And so I look at Josiah and, he got out of, he removed idol worship out of the temple. And, so the best way for me to answer that is to make sure that I am not worshiping any other God. Like, I am not, deeming myself even better than what I am, or deeming other people or putting other people up on a pedestal, because then I start to idolize them. And anything that is put before God, that can even be, what we do at home, what we, how we spend our time. If we look at it from that standpoint, and God is convicting our hearts of certain actions, we know what that feels like. I mean, we know when God is saying, Anita, you might want to just not say that, or Anita, you might not necessarily want to do that, or whatever. Little decisions like that can be a victory as we are living a life totally set out for God. And I would imagine that Josiah was probably pretty strict, and people thought that he was super strict with his rules and his, obedience and what have you. And it probably made some people a little uncomfortable. But the reality of it is, all the people who were under him at that time entered into the covenant. He allowed for the people to know what he said, and they entered into that covenant with him. And he changed a whole entire nation. People want to have really strong leaders who are going to obey. And Josiah was that king. I mean, it says in the word, there was no king like him who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. Nor did any like him arise after him. And may we be like a Josiah. May our faith in our life be set out for holiness. May we have a heart that is purposed to be different and to shine our light for God. Have a heart for God. And, despite what he lived like, and despite the example that he had a dad and a granddad that were evil in God's eyes. And they had access to all the scribes, and all of the law, and yet they chose differently. And I am so glad for Josiah's life. And it can show you and me that despite having parents who don't believe in God, despite having parents or grandparents who are not great examples, we can live for God. And he became the most holy king ever, despite not having family members giving him and showing him the way. Josiah kept that covenant, and he was the most godly king of Judah in all of history. And so today's challenge to dig deeper is to ask yourself the question, do you know someone who is not set out to pursue God? And the challenge would be to pray for them to be set out for God's ways. And if you can contact them today, just call them. Simply call them and let them know that you love them. You don't have to preach at them. You don't have to tell them, they're wrong in their decisions. You don't have to try and be their Holy Spirit. Just call them today and let them know that you love them. And put your faith in action as we close out the book of 2 Kings. And you've seen how 1 Kings and 2 Kings and all of the examples, about faith. If you can remember the Arwen ride and all of the examples that I had about people with faith when when death was surrounding them. Put your faith in action, and it will change someone's world and set them free if you are used and submit yourself to God and use them. So call one person today, just one person. The people followed Josiah because of the decisions that he made, and you will have people follow you too. So set out to pursue the right path. And so your challenge today is to call that one person. You know who they are. Call them and let them know how much you love them. And when you pull out your journal, after you do this, then write down who you prayed for today. And write down anything you can about the phone call. And if you have a journal and it's associated with today, 2025, then who did you pray for today? Write down about that phone call. How did it go? What did they say? Were they blessed by your phone call? Was there any other conversation points that you guys had? You never know what one phone call to someone who is not pursuing God, you never know what your love could do for their heart. And I hope today inspired you as we close out the book of 2 Kings, and we start tomorrow on Lamentations, and we end the month in the book of Lamentations. And so I hope that you are inspired and that the next 2 days you'll read. This is honestly not necessarily my favorite book in the Bible. I have a lot of favorites, but this is one of them. My heart just, I don't know, it bleeds when I read it. And so I want you for the next 2 days to get ready for the book of Lamentations, and just remember to go out and live your best faith-filled life every day. And if you don't have my devotional, be sure and look in the show notes, as well as the journal. If you've listened to me long enough, you know that you have a journal entry to put in every single day. No better way is to find the journal that's associated with this devotional and write down what comes to your mind. And that way you have documentation of it. And until tomorrow, keep rinsing, reflecting, and repeating. God bless you.